place on the planet where you have a complete sequence of geological strata from the Cambrian or Precambrian granites of primordial rock up until the present. So it's really just making a lot of inferences. There's no direct observations. And as we creationists know, direct observation is much more important and much more reliable than inference. We can have a little conversation about that around the campfire tonight in terms of how science actually works. If you've got your shirt, you're standing next to somebody with a shirt, or you go back and take a look at your guidebook. Remember those little tilty strata down there? Creationist view is that those strata, as you probably remember right now, are the original created rock plus what accumulated between the creation week and the flood itself. So there was some deposition. Then those rocks were tilted, and creationists vary a little bit as to whether the tilting occurred, at least the one for the creation rock, because of the massive forces that God used for the creation, or whether that tilting took place during the flood, which actually makes a little bit more sense because it's a whole lot of strata that are tilted.
Including strata that they claim occurred before the flood but after creation. So
Details. Creation scientists are still working out those details. I mean, you know, you just heard that uniformitarian scientists don't have all the answers either. And you know, as more observations are made, you come up with a new explanation, and that's just the same as us creation scientists. So we're working on those anomalies that don't fit.
I have another
But
question.
as Gish said, the story of the great unconformity is here you have direct evidence of the hand of God coming in and shearing the hell off of these deposits. So our explanation is much more parsimonious. And we all know that science loves parsimony.
and creationists do really like the fact that there's this unconformity, that the great unconformity can be found all over the world. And it's like, see, global flood. And then, but if these rocks are all coming in, they note the basal, they may note these basal conglomerates because they're like, of course, all this rock's getting chewed up and it's going to be splatted along, you know, so you have these conglomerates. But what they miss is that, yeah, okay, that's a flood conglomerate, some big storm comes along, surges in on this little high point as the ocean's rising. But then you have this nice, gentle beach get built on top of it. And we can go out on a bar at camp tonight and we can talk about some of what, if people are interested, I'd be happy to. I wasn't going to bore people with really contemporary sedimentology particularly, but you know, we can go out on a bar and we can look at the processes going on that build these sorts of structures, and they're very quiet. You know, here is in effect the height of your bar, and we know that when we look at things, you can find ripple marks in these rocks. Ripples are made at the wavelength, the point between crest and crest of the ripple is 1/2 the water depth. So if you have a ripple this wide, it's going to make a cross bed about that tall, and it's going to be water depth of about that. And you look at the size of the ripples and the water depth when we stand out at a bar. We stand out on lunch, and everybody goes out and stands on those bars while we're eating lunch to stay cool. But if you really look at what's going on underneath your feet with the sedimentation, so to make a bar like this, water depth is probably about that deep. And then here another storm comes in, it picks up stuff from a higher point, deposits it off. One of the things that always goes on in sedimentation, you're always moving something from a higher point to a lower point. You can have this big surging water coming through and it's going to be picking stuff up, but as soon as that water surge is done, it's going to immediately start to deposit. You always, to get the kind of stacks that the creationists need, you're going to always have to have someplace higher to be bringing that sediment from. The sediment isn't going to be at this level and then move over here, in effect. We don't, even in our wildest sedimentary conditions, we have sediment gravity flows or glaciers. They're still moving that sediment from a higher stratigraphic point, what we refer to in sedimentary geology is this stratigraphic base level. If you're above stratigraphic base level, you erode. If you're below stratigraphic base level, you deposit. In effect, if you flood the whole world, everything ends up below stratigraphic base level. All you can do is deposit. And so while that might work for the first couple thousand feet of sediment, they're stacking on 3 or 4 miles of vertical sediment, in a sense, with still how much work it's.
Jenny,
Yes, I'm curious. I'm curious what the total number of creation scientists there are out there that are doing the kind of work that you guys are talking about. I mean, really, they're in the canyon or they're wherever. They know geology, and they're putting this story together? I'm just curious.
Very few. Her question, if you didn't hear it, is how many creation scientists are actually doing the kind of work that would support the flood theory. Pretty much the Institute for Creation Research folks, 2 or 3 people around Steve Austin, are really the only ones actively working, certainly in Grand Canyon. Now, you'll find the armchair scientists, so to speak. There's another probably 10 or 15 who will be looking at the research papers and giving them a creationist twist. How do we explain this with the special creation model, with the flood model? We do it this way. The total number of creation scientists who are actually actively working on something, most of them have day jobs. But the number of
And they're not
creation
mostly
science supporters, the number of people who really believe in this stuff, can be easily measured in the thousands, no more. Members of the Creation Research Society is the best indication of that. Creation Research Society was begun back in the 1960s, around the same time as the Institute for Creation Research. And the purpose of the Creation Research Society was to publish in a journal, the Creation Research Society Quarterly, the CRSQ, publish in a journal the scientific papers of the research of creation science, because standard journals, they said, were closed to them because of this bias that the uniformitarian and evolutionary scientists had. So they were being kept out for no good reason. So they wanted to found their own journal. And you can get the Creation Research Society Quarterly. You can read this online. They've got all of their past issues, and CRSQ.org. Take a look at it. You'll be very interested. It's fascinating. You'll find biologists, geologists, astronomers who some of whom do a small amount and do actual research. When we were up at Copenhagen in Sandstone, remember we talked about the creation scientists who did actual aquarium experiments with small lizards, seeing what kind of footprints they made underwater as opposed to the claim of everyone else in science that these footprints that we saw on the big slab are really made in dry environments rather than marine environments. But very few of the research is actually laboratory or field, getting out, here's a new discovery, here's my explanation of it. Most of it is taking established literature and giving it the creationist twist. So it's very interesting to look at the CRSQ. The total number of members of the Creation Research Society has never gone above about 2,500. That's rounding up on a good day with the wind at your back. You have to have a graduate degree to be a member of the CRS. So that's master's or PhD. An awful lot of those people are engineers, who of course are not actually doing research. They have day jobs, and they're interested in this, and they belong to the society to support it, much as I would belong to GSA, though I'm not a geologist, or I would belong to the Society for the Study of Evolution, even though I don't do evolution research. So they similarly they're doing something else, but they support the society. They're interested in getting the publications. We'll talk tonight, if you'd like, about creation science, intelligent design, how this whole system evolved, if you will. The intelligent design professionals are yet smaller. There's really fewer than 20 who you could say would be doing book research. Maybe 30, rounding way up, counting the people at the Biologos Institute and the fellows of the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. That would be a very generous estimate. So we're not talking about very many people who are doing this kind of research. But as I'll explain tonight, we are dealing with people who have a very strong ideological position through which they filter the observations of here and laboratory sciences, biology, astronomy, and whatever. One of the key philosophical approaches, if you will, of the creation science folks is their contention, which was brought up by Henry Morris back in the 60s and has been widely spread and repeated and fully believed in by all members of this group, is that, which regular science would certainly attest to, data do not speak for themselves. We can see the data here. We've got granite, we've got sandstone, we've got stuff with big stones in it, stuff with little stones in it. The data are here, but it is the interpretation. It is the inferences you make from the data that allow you to build theory. Absolutely true. They will then go on to say that if you look at these data, as we just did, and Gish is a very nice explanation, you look at these data through the lens of a uniformitarian geology or from an evolutionary biology, the idea that there's been this long period of time, the planet has changed slowly, reconfiguring itself through time. Life has originated but gone through stages rather than having appeared all at one time in its present form as we see living things today. If you look at it through that kind of evolutionary perspective, if you have those glasses on, as Ken Ham would say from the Answers in Genesis organization, then you would make certain interpretations, but it is your bias, it is your theory that you are imposing upon the data. We creation scientists, on the other hand, we would say, accept the word of the Bible that the earth is young, there's only thousands of years, and the idea that it took millions of years to deposit all of this is absurd. You don't have that much time. You only have thousands of years. So given that truth, how do you interpret the data looking through your creationist lenses? Some of you have seen my book, Evolution versus Creationism. In the second edition, I actually have a nice little selection from Ken Ham's website. They were very generous about giving us permission to use it. That even speaks specifically about using your creationist glasses. So the lens through which you interpret the same data really determine the conclusions that you come up with, the conclusions and inferences that you come up with. We creation scientists are just doing science just like you evolutionary scientists are. So how would you answer that? If a student came up to you at the college or high school level, or if you were talking to someone coming out of one of these canyons, or who were ahead of us perhaps, or someone who we don't remember who was a creationist, how would you counter that idea? Anybody got any ideas? What might you bring up to challenge that notion? That it's just our way of looking at things, your way of looking at things, you have your conclusion, we have our.
Well, you might say that it's highly improbable that all of the people of the creationist bent happen to also be very big Bible believers.
Certainly.
Whereas there are a number of deeply religious people among the scientists who go, what's your term, the uniformitarian?
Uniformitarianism. It just means.
Is that like
processes that
anti-disestablishmentarianism?
went on in the past are similar to processes that.
That's what someone like me would call traditional geology.
Correct.
Constancy of process.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's Big Hutton's big thing, is that the processes that we can assume act in the past are limited to the process we can watch having happened now. We don't try to assume processes were different in the past than the processes that we see in the present.
Although to creationists, the processes of creation were different from any that we know today. That is, as I said in another place on the trail, something that escaped philosophers. But your point is very good, because creationists are very quick to point out the high level of atheism amongst standard scientists. And there is survey research to show that indeed the percentage of scientists who are not believers, who don't believe in God, who are atheists or agnostics or humanists, is considerably higher than the percentage of the general public. The percentage of scientists who are non-believers is something in the neighborhood of 60%, 60, 70%.
It reaches its peak at the National Academy.
Pardon me?
I'm going to just point that out.
Well, that survey has some real
Yeah.
problems, doesn't it?
I can believe it, yeah.
I can talk about the problems with that survey.
But it's not 100%.
No.
Thank you. That is absolutely the point.
Why is it the opposite? Why aren't there a
His point
handful?
was it's not 100%.
But you can then scientists
So,
have a lot of
would there,
different,
say that again, dude?
scientists have a lot of different religions, and they just subscribe to the Bible. So we have a lot of other belief systems taking place in science.
And the question you might raise is, why is it that scientists who are Christian or Hindu or Jewish or non-believers, why is it that those scientists come up with the same explanation? Well, maybe it's because they have this mindset that is not related to atheism. Maybe, although it's easier for the creationists to saddle that view with atheism, certainly. Maybe it's because they just have blinders on. They're not willing to look at the data from the standpoint of a 6,000-year-old.
Gee, one thing is that science never starts with the answer and works backwards. You usually try to start with your own mind so that you're not selective in your data.
If you didn't hear her, she made a very appropriate point that starting with your conclusion and working backward is generally not the way you do science. But what's wrong with that?
But you can do that. Biblical science is historical view. You can show that the short earth creationism was a very little part of the creationists. The gap theory theory was much more important, and it was just an accident that Price and Morris and these people took over the road.
Yes, that certainly is true, that creationism is a very broad idea.
But
And they just selected one very narrow form of young earth creationism but it has certainly become very, very popular in the United States and alas, spreading elsewhere as well. But yeah, you're right, it's not the only creationism.
I don't know how persuasive Rose's argument is, because I think the response to that is, look, you people have had atheism drilled into your heads by these atheist liberal teachers ever since you were toddlers. So of course, everything you see here is going to be with the understanding that you have to explain it in terms of evolution. And so your bias is no less than, you say, my bias is as a creationist.
Well, but the point with assuming the answer is that you read in the Bible 6,000 years or whatever number you want. You've just assumed the answer. In more traditional geology, you go out and you actually do age dating and you measure sedimentation rates and you do all these various other things and you put the time scale together. We didn't just pull 4.5 billion years out of a hat. We actually did it with an awful lot of very difficult and careful research. We did not assume an answer, whereas on the creationist side, 6,000 years, folks, that's it. The answer, you got to make the data fit the answer.
And
But
I think
isn't that a bias as well, saying you've got to start with data and then draw conclusions? I think that's what Ed was sort of saying.
People like to believe that science is done by analyzing data in the absence of any prejudice, but that's really, to be honest, that's not the way it does. You kind of come up with plausible hypothesis and then test it. But you could come up with an initial hypothesis of 6,000 years, start testing, and after a while you scratch your head and say, it's not working so well.
The development of geology works that way in terms they start out with some concept that the Earth is relatively young, not necessarily. What Usher does is the first scientific research into the age of the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
He says, I have this data.
Bishop Usher being the one who came up with the idea that the world is 4,004 BC, that's enough.
But he didn't, we laugh, sometimes he's sort of laughed at, because, but there was the best data they had. It was the only data. Oh, we have this book. The book is supposedly has everything from the beginning, so we just add it all up and we get a date. And then, but you realize by the time you get into the people like Leonardo da Vinci make some comments about being that there's something going on here. Of course, Nicholas Stenos, who lays down this law, we can go to any stack of rocks and come up with a historical theme that's going on. This came first, this came second, this came third, this came fourth. And Hutton adds to this notion that, well, not only we know 1, 2, 3, 4, but we also recognize that something isn't here, the lack of it. And so you start to see that from a view of the Earth that, because Steno's a Catholic cardinal, and he assumes the Earth is, not necessarily 4,004 BC, but they think that the Earth is on our time scales, the range of time we can think of. And it's really when Hutton realizes that there is all this empty space that now we're starting to look at time scales that are far beyond what we can conceive of. And people started to recognize that we could also at the same time correlate rocks and set them up. So this nice Steno's laws works for this one stack here, but how does this stack over here relate to the stack that you go see in Wisconsin or something? And that's where you start to get into that. So that you get up into the 1820s and people starting to think, wow, the Earth is really old, but how old? Well, the best thing you had was, well, what are the current rates of sedimentation? How fast is the gravel piling up in that river? And Avicenna, the Islamic scholar, does this with the Nile Delta, actually much earlier, but all this stuff comes in and they say, well, the Earth's about 200 million years old. That's the date that Lyell's working. That's the date that Charles Darwin had, more or less at his disposal, a couple 100 million years old. And it's not until radiometrically dating comes about that we realize the Earth is way older than anybody would have even thought based on just sedimentation rates alone.
And that gets us back actually to Alan's comment. When he was saying that we didn't just make this up. We took measurements and we tested our explanations and we did a lot of stuff to come up with these conclusions. We didn't just blow it out of the
I
hat.
remember when the world wasn't
because-
4.5 billion years old.
We didn't get there
And
because we were
it's
interested.
a very good point that, I mean, I'd just like to add to that because the kinds of techniques that were used to come up with those conclusions, the radioisotopic dating techniques and some of the other geochemical techniques that we use, that Gish just mentioned, those are actually based on other fields of science. And were actually discovered in other fields of science. They weren't just something cooked up by evolutionists to prove the world is old so we can, foment atheism. That isn't the point. The fact is that if we are wrong about these strata, then those other sciences are also wrong. And those other sciences are pretty important. Those other sciences are used in an awful lot of processes and machinery and getting people to the moon and everything else.
Well, those are the ones that were doing nuclear physics to build bombs and things like that.
Yeah,
So
exactly. So-
their bombs worked.
Even earlier than that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, but
Bertram
the
Boltwood and
that was the radioactive analysis starting with
Looks
Madame
like
Curie
Gish
and
wants
so
to
on.
take a